Hello, and welcome to Community Pulse, a bi-weekly CAN TV program that features local leaders and organizations that's focused on improving the health and well-being in the city of Chicago. Community Pulse is presented by Foxglove Alliance, a public healthcare coalition that is supported by the Hectone Institute of Medicine, that's in partnership with the Healthcare Council of Chicago, managed by the Third Horizon Strategies and Hectone Nurses and the Humanities. Whew, got that out. My name is Tacora, one of the Community Pulse rotating community co-hosts. I am with Hectone Nurses and Humanities and the AMSN Chicago Chapter 317. Today, we are so lucky to have Dr. Joshua Hauser here with us to talk a lot bit about, we're excited about the healing power of medicine and poetry. I would first like to take a moment to thank Cora Palmer, who's the president of the AMSN Chicago chapter and the lead board member for Nurses in the Humanities. She connected Dr. Hauser and I'm just truly excited. I've been looking forward to this interview. It's where my passion of the arts and, of course, medicine and humanities collide. So I've been looking forward to this interview. Welcome, Dr. Hauser.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for connecting with me. Appreciate
Yes. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Dr. Hauser? Who is Dr. Hauser?
Thank you for asking. So my name is Joshua Hauser, and I'm a palliative care physician at Northwestern. I'm at the medical school there, the Feinberg School of Medicine, and the hospital, Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and also at the Jesse Brown VA. I see patients in the hospital who have serious illnesses, and I'll talk a little bit about what palliative care is in a moment. And I do a lot of teaching at the medical school and for medical students and residents and fellows and colleagues of all sorts. That's really one of my passions in the world. I'm also a father and a husband to two college-aged children who are now adults, and a wife who's an educational researcher at the Erickson Institute in Chicago. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
I love it. Absolutely love it. And as you mentioned, we will get into describing what palliative care is. So we'll jump right in. Can you describe, one, define, and then two, describe what palliative care is?
Sure. So palliative care is the care for patients with serious illnesses that focuses on quality of life, support for them and their families, and symptom control. So as a palliative care physician, I work with a team of nurses and other physicians, social workers, chaplains, and many others to mostly I see patients in the hospital. I'm a hospital-based palliative care physician, but they're palliative care colleagues who are physicians and other healthcare professionals who see patients as outpatients, who see patients in nursing and long-term care facilities, and who see patients at home. Palliative care is related to hospice, which is a term that more people are familiar with. Palliative care is a newer term. Hospice is care that's often closer to the end of life and often care that's more exclusively focused on comfort and often in the home, although not always. Palliative care is a little bit more of a flexible term and a flexible approach in that we see patients who might be getting chemotherapy, might be getting other intensive therapies, and help to support them in any way we can. We think about physical pain, we think about their psychological coping, we think about their spiritual experience, we think about their families and their social experience as well.
Thank you for that description and definition. And you're right, our audience, everyone knows hospice, but not a lot of people know what palliative is. So thank you for that. What ignited your passion for palliative care?
So, this is going to sound a little bit like a cliche, but it actually is the truth. When I was a medical student, which is more than 25 years ago now.
No way.
Thank you. You're a good friend, Tacora. When I was a medical student, there were two patients that I had the privilege of taking care of who really left a really important impression on me. And it was interesting because one patient was near the beginning of my third year of medical school, which is a time when we do a lot of clinical work, and one patient was towards the end of my time in medical school, of third year. And one patient was on my internal medicine rotation, and he was a young man, and I still remember his name. I obviously won't share it, but I still remember his name. He was a young man in his 30s. He had an illness called scleroderma, which is a connective tissue disease, an autoimmune disease, and it can be very serious. It can also be very mild. He happened to have a very serious case of it, and it was affecting his lungs and was taking his life because of its effects on his lungs. And I remember sitting with him, sitting with the team that I was working with, and trying to think about how could we connect with this young man, very young man, who was dying way too soon. How can we think about his comfort, his shortness of breath? How can we think about supporting him and his family? How can we think about just being present with him? And I didn't have a lot of answers. And quite frankly, a lot of people around me didn't have a lot of answers. So it felt like an opportunity. And then zoom ahead towards the end of the year, that same year, this time on a surgery rotation, I was part of a team taking care of a woman who came in for the repair of a diaphragmatic hernia, which is generally a benign thing. In other words, it's a pretty routine operation. And she'd been healthy all her life. She was probably in her 60s or 70s. And on the operating room table, literally on the operating room table, when her abdomen was opened in order to repair this hernia, she had many liters of fluid in her abdomen. It's called ascites in medical terms. But she had many liters of fluid in her abdomen, which wasn't supposed to be there.
Right.
And what that was suggestive of was a diagnosis of ovarian cancer. And in her case, it was a very advanced ovarian cancer. And with her, I remember, and I'm grateful for this experience because it's helped to shape who I am. With her, I remember, walking in the room and all of us, certainly myself, but not just myself, not knowing how to talk about that with her, not knowing what to say. Should we say anything about it? Should we just concentrate on her surgical wound? And feeling very awkward.
So familiar.
I felt terribly awkward. So, both of those patients, I think there were others as well, certainly role models and mentors of mine, made me think about, what's it like to be with, to connect with, to help take care of and support in medical ways around physical symptoms, but also in more psychosocial or human ways, patients living with serious illness.
Yes. Your stories, your examples just resonated with me. We can all go back to stages in our lives and our career where we've had those patients who have shaped our lives to, what it is today. So thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
What prompted you to prescribe poetry as a treatment plan? Over the last couple years, we've seen animal therapy, we've seen music, multiple things, but poetry. Like, what made you use that as a treatment plan?
Yeah, well, you're kind to formalize it with. I don't think it's quite up there with music therapy quite yet, or art therapy.
Well, who knows?
But you never know. And but all kidding aside, I think that probably 6 or 7 years ago, I met someone from the Poetry Foundation, which is a local foundation here in Chicago. And part of their mission, and I'm not going to get this quite right, but part of their mission is to introduce poetry and the humanities in settings other than kind of the academic ivory tower. So thinking about, poetry in elementary schools and poetry in prisons and poetry in community centers and a poetry slam. And through through a conversation that initially, we said, well, what about poetry in healthcare? Now, I claim zero originality in this. There are other people that think about this too.
Yes.
But what that led to for us is, first of all, actually thinking about it with ourselves as healthcare professionals. So thinking about using poetry as a reflective method, reflective reading and discussion within our palliative care team. So at a meeting of physicians and nurses and social workers and chaplains and other people spending time with us, we might read a poem or two and talk about it and facilitate a conversation around this poem. So we did that for several years, and we actually still do that as part of our regular palliative care conferences. The next thing that happened was we thought about doing this at the VA, and I'm grateful for a colleague at the VA who said, what about doing this not just with healthcare professionals, but with patients as well? Now, I had wondered about it with patients, but sort of him prompting me was even more helpful. And so we actually started a monthly, this was before COVID, a monthly workshop. And when I say workshop, it's an hour-long time. It includes pizza, which is an important thing to include
For
pizza.
sure.
It includes some, lunch. And it was a time at the VA where healthcare professionals, physicians and others, got together with veterans and their families in the same room and read some poems together. Which was really unusual for me because, and this may be your experience too, Tacora, there are a number of different educational things that we do together as healthcare professionals, and that's, I think, important. And then there are also educational things that patients do together, support groups and things like that, but the opportunity to do both of those simultaneously was kind of cool. And then the last step has been thinking about this just with patients, or not just with patients, but in the course of our palliative care, in the course of seeing a patient in the hospital, which is where I use it, to have literally a poem in my pocket or a few poems and ask a patient, do you want to spend a little time reading and talking about a poem? And at first they look at you like what? Right? And that's okay. And so we talk about, do you like to read? What do you like to read? And obviously, there are challenges for patients who might not have health literacy or other forms of literacy. But one of the great things about a poem is that it's short. It can be read aloud. It can be read with two people. And so along with the Poetry Foundation and a colleague, a former fellow with us who's now at Yale, her name is Nora Seeger, who I've been working with for years now, we developed a protocol really for introducing the topic of poetry, for talking about what we do, for then reading a poem together, and then a few questions about literally what was that like? What did you notice? What did that bring up for you? What does it make you think about?
Yes.
And that's what we do.
And what do you think the healing power is of poetry?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's such a good question. For me, I think probably since I was perhaps a child, certainly since college, the humanities, and whether those are, the narrative arts, poetry or literature, whether those are visual arts, quite frankly, whether those are music, I think those can be very sort of grounding and connecting things for people.
So true.
And, it's a little unorthodox to think about that in medicine, but it's less and less unorthodox every day. So I think part of the power is it's an external thing that's not just about how sick are you?
Yes.
How are you doing? How are you doing? And those are good questions, by the way, or versions of those questions. Those are important questions, but it's sort of something else to look at together. It's another place that your mind might go. And it's something that two, again, humans, which is what a doctor and a patient are, what a nurse and a patient are, two humans can connect over.
Yes, it's that humanistic approach that I really love about this. So I have a couple other questions, and I had a sequential order, but I want to just backtrack just a little bit.
Please.
What is your favorite poem?
I don't know that I have a favorite poem. I have a couple poems that I kind of go back to a fair bit, and I'll talk about three.
Okay.
So I have probably a favorite poet whose name is Wallace Stevens, and I was introduced to Wallace Stevens as a poet, I think, during high school. In fact, I know during high school. And he's just a fascinating poet, very spiritual poet, not particularly religious, but a very spiritual poet. And he has a beautiful poem, again, that I was first introduced to in high school called The Final Soliloquy on the Light of Something. I'm not remembering the title exactly as I'm sitting here. But it's a beautiful poem about two people together and sort of just being together. And the last line of it is something like, in which being together is enough. And And that to me is sort of an example of the importance of, again, how we connect as people, as as family, as doctors, as patients, as nurses, as patients, as colleagues. So that poem has always been a favorite of mine, and I've occasionally read that with a patient. That's sort of a personal favorite of mine. There's a second poem that has kind of a family connection for me. My great aunt, who's no longer alive, but who was alive when, when I was growing up, was a poet herself. Mm-hmm. And she wrote a poem that's an interpretation of the 23rd Psalm, which is obviously a very spiritual psalm.
Favorite.
And her poem is sort of a version, her interpretation of this psalm. And I grew up with that poem that was read at different family events.
Love it.
Some joyful events and some sad events, right? So that poem is another one that's sort of very evocative and meaningful for me for any number of reasons. And I've sometimes read that poem with patients. And then I guess the third is, in the course of our work with the Poetry Foundation, I've been introduced to and now friends with a local poet whose name is Jacob Saenz, S-A-E-N-Z. I want to shout out to Jacob, who's a wonderful poet, and I teach with Jacob at the medical school. He helps teach our medical humanities, a medical humanities seminar that we do for the medical students, and Jacob has a poem called Evolution of My Block, which is about his growing up and some of his experiences. And that poem has been one that we've read a lot with patients. It's about growing up in Cicero and some of his experience as a Latinx man. And that poem as a sort of launching pad, if you will, for sort of patients talking about their own growing up has been very powerful for us. So I didn't do a good job answering your question about one, but I've given you a few.
And I hope that, you can share those poems with me.
Of course.
It's just something nostalgic about, like, reading poetry or hearing a certain song where it transposes you, like, back into a time and a place, Of course, this is about you and your poetry.
Yeah. No, sorry to interrupt. I think that's so true, and I think one of the things that I've also, sort of this project has made me think about over the years and in kind of our continuing work with the Poetry Foundation, poetry is a very broad term. And, there are things that are very traditional poems. They're in books or a magazine or et cetera. But, of course, music is a version of poetry, and rap music is a version of poetry, and folk music, and there are many versions of poetry that we have in the world. So, of course, music can do the same thing. I couldn't agree more.
And, like the memories of being, like, transposed, when I was doing a lot of research and preparing for today, thought back, like, to my English teacher who, you will learn this poem, Marianne Williamson, Our Deepest Fear. You will learn this. And just going back in time with that, I've used that poem so much throughout my life, and I encounter many different things. But, thank you for sharing. And I hope you're able to, share the poetry that you're using. Speaking of, like, preparing for this interview, I read an article that highlighted an encounter with one of your patients with the poem Invictus. By William Ernest Henley. And I think what really, really resonated with me in this article is when you read the last line of the poem. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. When you read that to the patient, and then he said, I am not going to roll up in no ball and cry because I've got cancer. I'm just going to keep going. Keep moving. It is what it is. The poem, my intake on this is that the poem empowered the patient and it gave him hope. I just think reading this was just so empowering and it was so rewarding. I'm sure that you've had, like, many patient experiences like that. Are there any other that you can share that resonates with you with the use of poetry and hope?
Yeah. Thank you for reminding me of that. That was an interesting, brings back an interesting memory because that was a poem that he actually brought.
I love that poem.
it's really interesting because, as I mentioned, we have some poems that we have, but what we will often do, Nora and me and my colleague Nora Seeger and other folks who do this, is ask, are there favorite poems that you have? And I'm surprised, quite frankly, that a lot of people have all these favorite poems that they've been thinking about. Now, not everybody, right?
Right.
And you can hear I have 3, for example. But there are quite a few patients that I've met who introduced me to poems. I had heard of that poem once upon a time, but this gentleman, if I'm remembering right, he actually had memorized that poem. Kind of like you're talking
most
about.
Most people do.
Right.
Yes,
so
yes.
he taught me about that poem, and I'm grateful for that. And I've heard of a number of poems in that way from patients. So, there are a couple sort of examples from somewhat recent times that I sort of go back to. So there's a patient with heart failure we were taking care of, congestive heart failure, and not much of a talker, which is a kind of an informal expression for someone who, and maybe I wasn't a good listener, I don't know which, but either way, he and I weren't connecting too well. So I decided to mix it up, which is part of what I like to do with this, and said, hey, you want to read a poem together? And there was something about him that led me to a poem that's called Ode to the Midwest by a poet named Kevin Young, who's a remarkable poet and a remarkable scholar. In many ways, he is either the current or immediate past president of the Smithsonian African American History Museum in D.C. So he's a very accomplished, again, intellectual as well as a poet. But he has a poem called Ode to the Midwest, which is funny. It's really funny. It has all these sort of kind of almost sarcastic comments about the Midwest. And I think it's from the Midwest. I don't think it's meant in a demeaning way. So we read this poem together, me and this patient. And I asked this patient, as I do with most patients, what did you notice? What struck you? And there's a line in this poem, I don't remember the specific line, but there's a line in this poem about something shining. Something at a fair or something in the street, I don't even remember. But what I do remember is that this patient said, yeah, that thing about that thing shining. And he said something like, I've always wanted to shine. So this is a poem. It's a funny poem. It's something shining in the street. It's something shining. I think there's a scene in the poem about a carnival, something shining at a carnival, which has nothing to do with being a patient, nothing to do with sickness. But of course, then a patient reading it talks about his experience of shining.
So it gave you guys a common ground, like a mutual.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, one last question before we begin to wrap up. What are your future hopes for poetry and medicine?
I'm smiling because you asked such good questions and important questions. As I said, I've been very gratified by sort of thinking about this as a source of support, as a source of connectivity, as a source of meaning for ourselves, as a nurse, as a doctor, as a healthcare professional. So almost like a sort of a team support, personal support technique. Now, it doesn't replace many other things. I don't want to be naive about it at all. Yeah. But as an element of that in our professional practice. Now, in terms of the future, does that mean we do it every day? No, we don't do it every day, right? But we do it once a month. We do it every few weeks. We do it every few months. I don't know. So thinking about those things for professionals. The second version of that is for students and trainees.
Yes,
so I've been doing for the last few years, I mentioned about Jacob and then my colleague Nora, who's now at Yale, we do a seminar for medical students about poetry and medicine. So that's very fulfilling, and thinking about how to expand that and think about that. We do it at Northwestern, but then we now start to do it at Yale under Nora's guidance. We had invited people the last couple of years with the advent of Zoom from Harvard Medical School, which is where I went to school, so I have a connection there. So think about how do we expand this for professionals. And then for for patients as well. I don't do it as often as I'd like to because I have to keep, reminding
Yes.
myself, and I have to keep making time for it. So I want to think a lot more for myself and for colleagues about how do we fit something like this into our routines, because life is busy.
It is.
For all of us.
For
and,
sure.
and for patients too, by the way. And so trying to understand a little bit more about how this fits into, our daily care. And as I mentioned, I take care of patients in the hospital with the vast, vast majority of my time with patients. So how this fits into the hospital care of patients. And then the last thing is trying to understand what its impact is. So I've given you my impression and my experience with some patients. And, when we first started doing this, we recorded the conversations that we had. So we recorded the reading, and then we recorded, literally what we talk about.
That. Yes.
And we're actually just now going through those recordings, those transcripts, to literally understand what are the themes that come up. Things like growing up, things like family, memory, those types of things. And then the last thing is really the harder one, which is, does this have an impact on someone's quality of life?
Yes.
I don't know if it does. I hope that it does.
I know. I hope so.
Yeah.
I really do. And I would love to get nursing students, of course, as an educator, that's my passion as well. So I would love to get this, in the world of nursing.
Yeah.
This has been phenomenal, and I wish we had more time. We may have to do a part 2. Who knows? But thank you so very much for your time.
My pleasure.
It is time for us to wrap up. Once again, we would like to thank Dr. Hauser for his time and for sharing his passion and his knowledge. I would also like to thank CAN TV, nonprofit service team, for their support in the production of this program. My name is Tacora Love. Thank you for watching Community Pulse, which airs on CAN TV, Channel 21, or is also available for streaming at cantv.org. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, Chicago.
Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.